Grace to you and peace from God's beloved. Amen. Please be seated. This week we are continuing our series, Great Cloud of Witnesses, with Melito of Sardis. We're talking about people, figures of the faith whom we might not be familiar, but who left a lasting impact. Well, Melito of Sardis isn't exactly a household name when it comes to early Christian leaders, isn't he? This 2nd century bishop of the Greek city of Sardis wasn't well remembered until fairly recently. He may have had a tremendous impact on early Christianity, especially with his literary input, but unfortunately, very few of his writings have survived. Until the 1930s, the only complete document we had from Melito was an open letter he wrote to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, which defended Christianity as a persecuted minority in the midst of a vast empire, asking him to reconsider his edict against Christians and call for an end to their persecution. Melito even went so far as to ask the emperor to declare Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. Well, of course, that wasn't going to happen as long as Marcus Aurelius was on the throne. He didn't exactly look kindly upon Christianity, especially from his brand of Stoic philosophy. And that would have to wait until the Emperor Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 for the Roman Empire to legally establish Christianity as the empire's official religion. But for Melito, hey, never hurts to ask, right? So we had what was called his Apology to Marcus Aurelius, by which apology he meant a literary style that defended the faith, not asking forgiveness for it. We also had other fragments of scattered writing, and he was mentioned in passing by his contemporaries, most notably Clement, the first bishop of Sardis, and the theologian Tertullian. Early church father Jerome also notes Melito's contribution to the faith for creating the Old Testament canon, or the books assembled that make up the Christian Old Testament. The Jewish scriptures are in different order, and they include some different books. But it wasn't until the early 20th century, until the 1930s, when a sermon was found. It was called Peri Pascha, or On the Passover. This sermon was a radical reinterpretation of the Passover story that we heard from the book of Exodus this morning. The story where the lamb's blood was smeared on the Hebrew slaves' doorposts while they were captive in Egypt, and the angel of death then passed over their home, sparing their firstborn child, but killing the eldest heir of those homes which did not have the lamb's blood on the door. In this sermon, Jesus is identified as the firstborn who was killed. It's a very interesting interpretation. So Melito says this, he says, if anyone grasped the darkness, he was pulled away by death. And one of the firstborn, grasping the material darkness in his hand, as his life was stripped away, cried out in distress and terror, "Whom does my hand hold? Whom does my soul dread? Who is the dark one enfolding my whole body? If it is a father, help me. If it is a mother, comfort me. If it is a brother, speak to me. If it is a friend, support me. If it is an enemy, depart from me, for I am firstborn." Before the firstborn fell silent, the long silence held him and spoke to him. "You are my firstborn. I am your destiny." The silence of death. I am your destiny. The silence of death. For Melito, the Passover lamb is also the victim. Jesus identifies not only with those who suffer exploitation and slavery, but also with all of us who suffer humanity's horror, the silence of death. For Melito, it is at that moment when Jesus hung in sorrowful agony, calling out to his Father and receiving no answer to his cries, in feeling life slip from his body, in gasping for his final breaths, it is at that moment that heaven and earth meet in Jesus, who is fully human and fully divine. It is at that moment that God knew what it was like to have a firstborn child killed. It was at that moment that God knew what it was like to die. This is a powerful moment in our history. And it would have been a greater moment if Melito ran with this. But then instead, he pivots and he places blame where he shouldn't. And in doing so, he creates a rift that is today still trying to be healed. Melito places the blame squarely on the Jews for Jesus' death, not on Pilate, who signed the execution order, not on the Romans who carried it out, but on the Jews who were divided at best at what should have happened to Jesus as he stood in the prisoner's box at trial. So Melito glares at the Jews, and through gritted teeth and fiery eyes, he goes on to say this: "Why was it like this, O Israel? You did not tremble for the Lord. You did not fear for the Lord. You did not lament for the Lord, yet you lamented for your firstborn. You did not tear your garments at the crucifixion of the Lord, yet you tore your garments for your own who were murdered. You forsook the Lord. You were not found by him. You dashed the Lord to the ground. You too were dashed to the ground, and you lie quite dead." I find it troubling where Melito trained his words, especially since he was such a gifted writer. That made his attacks on the Jews all the more toxic. He was deeply threatened by Judaism, more so, it seems, than any other church leader. As we heard last week, Ignatius of Antioch was worried that there would be too much confusion between Christianity and Judaism, and the new Christian movement wouldn't be able to find its feet without distancing itself from its parent and now sibling religion we call Judaism. That may not excuse Ignatius's anti-Jewish writings, but it helps us understand them. But Melito didn't share Ignatius' worries that Christianity might become indistinguishable from Judaism. Christianity was well established as a religion by the time Melito arrived on the scene, established well enough that Marcus Aurelius knew who Melito was and was a public enough figure for people to listen to him. So early Christian growing pains weren't the problem. For Melito, his anger towards Jews was much more raw, more visceral. It was personal. For Melito, it was Jews that murdered Jesus. And while Jesus' death brought forgiveness of sins, the Jews still stood guilty of executing God's only Son. And since they were guilty of Jesus' death, they had no hope of salvation. For Melito, grace was withheld from the Jews, and they were destined to eternal fire. And because they murdered Jesus, the Jews, Israel, were no longer God's chosen people, the light to the nations, because now it was Christ's church that held that special place of honor in God's eyes. The Jews could pray all they wanted, they could have their feasts, they could sing their hymns, but God wasn't interested. God wasn't listening. God's ears went deaf to the prayers and praise of the Jews. The Jews were dead to God. God now only heard the prayers and the praise of Christ's church. There's a fancy theological term for this. It's called supersessionism, which means that after Jesus, the word Israel was used to indicate God's people, and it no longer meant the Jews. It exclusively meant the Christian church. It means that Christianity is the new Israel. And while Melito never used the word supersessionism, he is widely known for vigorously advancing the concept. and with devastating consequences for our Jewish sisters and brothers, friends and neighbors ever since. And Melito's well-meaning, if naive defenders say that he didn't hate the Jews, he just loved Jesus. I think that's half true. His theology would take Israel's very identity away from them. His anti-Jewish writings and preaching gave theological justification to active discrimination and persecution against Jews throughout history, and it endures to this day. So you're probably wondering why on earth I'm introducing you to such an awful guy like Melito. Why would I allow his message to be shared from this pulpit and in this place? Certainly I could find someone more suitably inspiring to bring to you. Someone with less hate in their heart, right? If you asked that, you wouldn't be alone. He's certainly a controversial figure in our history. But I chose Melito of Sardis because I think we can redeem him. We can take his initial thoughts and take them to a different, more life-giving conclusion. His writing may have taken him to a dark place, where his anti-Judaism infected his proclamation, but it need not take us there. And we can begin where he did, with the Passover. Some say that this is ground zero of his anti-Judaism, since he appropriated the Passover story for Christians, stealing it from the Jews, making it unrecognizable to them. Melito places Jesus and the church at the center of the story, not the Hebrew people and the God of Israel. As I mentioned earlier, you may remember in the story that the Hebrew people, as an act of resistance, were told to put lamb's blood on their doorposts. So when the angel of death arrives later that night, the angel would pass over the house, sparing their firstborn child. But those houses that did not have the lamb's blood on the doorframe, the angel of death would kill their firstborn child. Melito reinterpreted this story for Christians. In his version, Jesus was the Passover lamb whose blood saves us from the power of death. For Melito, this was really what the story was about. Passover was a metaphor for salvation in Jesus, the lamb, pure and spotless, who gave his life so that we might be spared death and given everlasting life. It was clear that's what he was talking about for Melito. That was the Passover message. And he puts these words in Jesus' mouth. He says, "Come then, all you nations of men, receive forgiveness for the sins that defile you. I am your forgiveness. I am the Passover that brings salvation. I am the Lamb who was immolated for you. I am the ransom, your life, your resurrection, your light. I am your salvation and your King. I will bring you to the heights of heaven. With my own right hand, I will raise you up, and I will show you the eternal Father." And this we can see a hearty amen. This is a powerful proclamation. This is what we believe as Christians. But I think there's also a missed opportunity here. Because just as the Hebrew people were enslaved in Egypt, the early church was being rounded up and persecuted in 2nd century Roman Empire. Melito's people knew oppression intimately. And in the Passover story, God was identifying with the slaves in bondage, rescuing them from the power of the empire. Melito could have turned this story around and saw Jesus, a Passover lamb, rescuing his people from the empire that was literally killing them. Instead of writing to Marcus Aurelius, begging for Christianity to be the established religion of the Roman Empire, the Passover story could have been an inspiration for resisting the empire. Melito could have stood with his Jewish sisters and brothers against the same persecutor by living out their common story, by saying no to the forces that were killing them. Because Passover is a story of being rescued from the empire, not by joining it. Passover is a story of freedom to be who God had created them to be, not to be co-opted by the forces that were keeping them in slavery. Passover was a story of God creating a unique people put on a special mission to be God's light shining in dark places, not compromising with the oppressors. All of which Melito was asking to do. If Marcus Aurelius was baptized, then that would be a victory for Christianity, right? But Melito missed an important piece. He saw Jesus' story only as a personal one, where his sins were forgiven. And he missed the wider vision of what God was doing in that community. But we don't have to make that same mistake. We can remember the Passover story with Jesus as the center as a way of living this story alongside our Jewish friends who see the story differently. But we can come together in hearing the Passover story as a story of resistance against oppressive powers. As Christians, we can see Jesus, the Passover lamb, who resists tyranny. Because Jesus is the Passover lamb that leads God's people from slavery of sin into the freedom of living as children of God. Jesus is the Passover lamb that stands with the hurting and the oppressed people of the world against those who would keep them down, and he leads them to a better future. Jesus is the Passover lamb that takes sides against powerful interests that use people to further their own selfish ends. Jesus is the Passover lamb that hears the cries of hurting people and brings them the renewal that they yearn for. When the Passover is the Hebrew story of mercy and rescue, or if it's the Christian story of salvation, Christians and Jews can come together to remember that the Passover is the story of freedom. It's the story of resistance. It's the story of liberation. Many Christians marched yesterday at the Worldwide Women's March on Washington, and they did so because of this story. For many Christians, this march on Washington around the world wasn't to protest the results of the election south of the border, results they didn't like. The intent wasn't to overturn the results of the Electoral College in the U.S. system. Many Christians, inspired by the Passover story with Jesus at the center, protested against what they see represented in the new American leadership, which could spill over and have consequences here in Canada and around the world. The march was a protest against a persistent misogyny, where women are too often treated as objects of men's desire, rather than strong, contributing members of society. The march was a protest against an ideology that sees economic growth as the sole metric to measure prosperity. The march was a protest against the glorification of brute strength over the values of mercy and compassion. The march was a protest against religious bigotry that singled out one particular faith group for discrimination. The march was a protest against intentional misinformation that created a poisoned public discourse. And for many Christians, the march was for human kindness in the public realm. The march was for creating a community where everyone had a chance to succeed. The march was for building a world where empathy is seen as a virtue. The march was for crafting a society that builds and maintains healthy relationships among peoples and nations and doesn't build walls because of fear and naked self-interest. And wherever you stand on the political spectrum, it's hard to argue that Jesus wouldn't be in favor of why many Christians marched yesterday. Their marching feet was the Passover in action. That was resistance against the empire that appears to be growing. That is the cry for freedom that reaches God's ears. But make no mistake, Passover is messy. There's no getting away from that because change is messy. Freedom is messy. It doesn't arrive without pain on both sides, and it's not sustained without struggle and vigilance. In the Passover, something new and beautiful is born from the pain of resistance. From the cries of the firstborn, the Passover is both a story of personal salvation and God's public response to destructive powers. From the cries of the firstborn, the Passover marks the beginning of a compassionate people, the birth of a nation that is a light to the nations, and declaration of freedom to those held in oppression. For Melito of Sardis, and also for us, the Passover is that birth of a new people, the message of newness of life, the announcement of freedom that was given to him and given to us in Jesus. Out of the death of slavery and the oppression and its oppression, a new people rise. And that's why finally Melito says this: understand, therefore, beloved, how it is new and old, eternal and temporary, perishable and imperishable, mortal and immortal, this mystery of the Passover. Old as regards the law, but new as regards the word, temporary as regards the model, eternal because of grace, perishable because of the slaughter of the Lamb, imperishable because of the life of the Lord, mortal because of the burial in the earth, immortal because of the rising from the dead. And may this be so among us. Amen.